Welcome everybody to the Tuesday Earth Environmental Data Science Seminar. I'm Nate Porter, postdoc and education team leader. Excited to introduce Heather Johnson, who is our speaker here this morning. We heard about the work that Heather was doing. I guess I first heard about the work that Heather was doing one evening last fall. I was on the couch watching TV, flipping through the channels, stumbled on something on Colorado Public Television that was bears in Durango. I thought that sounds interesting. I didn't catch the first part, but I watched the end and thought to myself, like, these would be some pretty cool folks, I think, to invite to the seminar. I wasn't totally sure, so I went into our Slack workspace and asked, like, hey, what do you folks think about inviting Heather's team to the seminar? Everybody agreed that it would be a great idea, and so I know we had to reschedule you, Heather, a couple of times due to our kind of rescheduling here at the lab, and so thanks for being patient with us. I'm glad to finally get you on the agenda. And so I'm going to read your bio here quick, Heather, and then we'll turn it over to you. So Heather Johnson is a research wild biologist at the USGS Alaska Science Center in Anchorage, Alaska. Heather got her PhD in wildlife biology from the University of Montana. She got her Master's of Science in Wildlife Science at the University of Arizona, and she did her BS in ecology at the University of California, San Diego. Heather's research primarily focuses on understanding how climate and anthropogenic-driven changes and habitat conditions influence the behavior and demography of large mammals and the effectiveness of management strategies for minimizing impacts. Prior to working for the USGS, Heather conducted research for the Colorado Parks and Wildlife and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Heather Johnson to the seminar. Okay, and then do I want to mute or?
Yeah, we'll unmute.
Okay, so I'm going to mute and then she shares her screen. Okay, Heather, the floor is yours.
Cool. Okay, let me get my screen here going. Hey, well, thanks, Nathan. And yeah, thanks for having me to your webinar. I really wished I was there in person because it's so nice to give talks in person these days instead of like this. But I really appreciate you having me. And it would be especially fun to be able to talk with you guys in person since you're in Colorado, right? Like that's where all this work was kind of born from. So yeah, I'll just dive right in. So I'm going to talk about this project that I did with bears in Colorado while I worked for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And let's see, let's get going here. And, this was, while I was the PI for this project, I mean, there's a massive effort that went into doing this work, particularly Stuart Breck, who's right there at Fort Collins at the National Wildlife Research Center, Dave Lewis, Lyle Wilmarth, Jared Laufenberg, Stacy Lishka, Joey Medina, and Rebecca Kirby. And I mean, on the bottom, you can see all the entities there that contributed in some way or another to doing this work. But, really, I mean, this was spearheaded by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And then it wouldn't have happened without the USDA, National Wildlife Research Center, the city of Durango, or Colorado State University. So like lots of these projects, it took a village to make this happen. And so this work was, it was motivated by all the interactions that, you have in Colorado with bears. If I was there in person, I would ask, for folks to show hands of how many people have had some kind of interaction or conflict with a bear. And my guess is that that most of you have had at some point living in Boulder, especially if you live or recreate over on the urban wildland kind of interface, that you've had interactions with bears. Right? This is pretty normal in Colorado. And in Durango, where we did the work, I mean, this is a place that everyone has a bear story. Amazing bear stories, bears coming into people's houses, eating cookies off their counters, all kinds of just wild bear stories. And when I started working for Colorado Parks and Wildlife in 2010, managing bear-human conflicts had just dominated the summers for the agency. Most of the wildlife officers at that point, I mean, all they were doing in the summers was managing bear conflicts to the exclusion of everything else. The agency was spending in certain years hundreds of thousands of dollars in single towns just managing conflicts when you had these like really bad bear years. And I'll talk about what those are, what that looks like later on. But you know, the agency is spending all these resources, all this time managing these issues. And so it raised a lot of questions as to, you know, why are these conflicts increasing? Are conflicts increasing because bears are changing their behavior? You know, is this because we have all this new anthropogenic food resources and expanding development on the landscape brings with it all kinds of human foods? Are bears learning to forage on this new food source? And is this driving increases in conflicts and interactions with bears? Is it because we simply have more bears? You know, is the bear population in Colorado like just exploded beyond, you know, where it should be? And is this a numerical response? And, you know, if we reduce the bear population, can we eliminate conflicts that way? You know, maybe it's some combination of these things that's driving conflicts. And ultimately, Colorado Parks and Wildlife wanted to know, you know, what they should do about it. And you can think if you can understand the mechanism, you know, depending on the mechanism, that would dictate what the best management, most effective management action might be. So if it really is a numerical response, like there's too many bears in Colorado, then it's really easy for Colorado Parks and Wildlife to increase harvest rates, reduce the bear population, and reduce conflicts that way. But if that's not the driver, if it's something like, well, bears are adapting to all this extra human food on the landscape, well, then that might require, you know, a very different management strategy. So, you know, this was really kind of what motivated the work that we were doing, trying to answer these questions. And so kind of largely the three pieces I want to talk about today with this project were, first, we wanted to determine what is the influence of human development on bear behavior and on bear population dynamics. We wanted to test the effectiveness of residential urban bear proofing to see how effective that was at reducing conflicts. This is what Colorado Parks and Wildlife, you know, it was touting that this was a solution. We had to lock up the trash, but there was really no data, really evidence that that was going to be very effective. And for municipalities to take this on, like do something like what Boulder's done, it can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, so Parks and Wildlife was really interested in testing, like, does this really work? And if so, let's have evidence to push municipalities towards this. And then we wanted to understand two public attitudes and behaviors related to bears, bear management, and bear human interactions, because, you know, we very quickly recognize that this is not just a bear problem, right? But this is as much of a bear problem it's a human problem. And as much as this involves kind of interactions on the bear side of things, it also involves kind of behaviors on the human side. So we tried to acknowledge that throughout what we were doing. So we decided, we looked kind of around the state, where should we do this study? There are conflicts happening in all kinds of hotspots around Colorado, but eventually we settled on Durango for a few different reasons. But what the big one is, Durango is a place where it was a hotbed of bear-human conflicts. I mean, you can see from the map there. I mean, this is a place where, like I said, everybody had a bear story. It's a town that's nestled in a valley that's surrounded by really great bear habitat all the way around. So there's a lot of public land surrounding this kind of main town core. Yeah, so I think, yeah. Oh, and you know, if I was there in person too, I'd probably ask how many of you guys have actually been to Durango, because one thing I learned from living in Colorado was that Durango is, it's like a lot of people in the Front Range have never been there, right? Because it takes an investment, a solid 7-hour drive. But you know, we're talking far in kind of the southwest corner, down by the New Mexico border. So we decided to do the study in Durango. We would have loved to replicate it multiple places, but these studies on large mammals are just so expensive. We settled on this as a starting place. And like lots of places in Colorado, Durango, which sits dead center in La Plata County, you know, this is a landscape that's changing. this outline here, this kind of greenish blob is the city limits outline. Outside city limit development is in the orange blobs, and in 1970, 50 years ago, this is more or less what the county looked like in terms of development. 30 years ago, this is what it looked like. Today, it looks something like this. So this is a landscape that has dramatically changed. And what was interesting to me is when I, went out trapping bears, everyone that you see wants to talk to you about how they think the bear population's changed or what they think about the bear population. But people do not recognize this change, right? Like these massive changes to the landscape that kind of go unnoticed by folks, which has always been interesting to me, but they're incredibly dramatic. We had bears in our study that were between 20 and 30 years old. We age bears, basically pull a tooth and could look at the layers of cementum to get an age. And so, you think about the changes on this landscape that's even happening within the lifespans of some of these animals is dramatic. And with all this extra development on the landscape comes lots of anthropogenic food resources. And then you put an animal like a bear on this landscape, like the ultimate food finding machine with one of the best senses of smell of any terrestrial mammal on the planet, and you're bound to have challenges. And I think what's also important to point out is that the growth of the development in La Plata County is unremarkable in Colorado. This shows relative changes in population size in different counties across the state. Here's La Plata County. It doesn't stand out. This isn't a standout. Bear habitat is pretty much everything west of I-25, and there's dramatic growth across the board. So this is happening across the state. Okay, so what did we find in terms of the influence of all this human development on bear behavior? Well, to look at bear behavior, we spent a lot of time trapping and collaring bears. We did just shy of 5,900 trap nights, where we put these traps around Durango. We were focused within about 10 kilometers of town. We wanted to trap and collar a group of bears that all had access to human food resources, but also to natural habitat. So they all had the same kind of choices of how, whether they wanted to use human development or natural habitat. We put traps in just shy of 300 different locations. We worked a lot on public land, but we also worked with 160 different private landowners. This is what our trap looked like. We trapped bears in the summertime. This trap here was set right behind a Mexican restaurant in Durango. That was one of our favorite kind of honey hole trapping spots. It was always successful. And our goal with this was to trap females. We wanted to trap and collar females. Females are the reproductive segment of the population, and generally for large mammal studies, we often focus on females because they are most informative about what's happening with changing populations. So our goal each year was to have 40 bears on the air, 40 collared bears a year. Then when bears died, we took the collar, we catch another bear, replace it. This bear, looks like she's dead, but she's just immobilized so that we could get a collar on her. And then after we collared those bears in the summer, then we'd track them to their dens in the winter and go into their dens. And from that, we could change out their collar batteries. We could look to see how many cubs they had in terms of reproductive success. Cubs are born in the den, and then they stay with their mom the whole next year, and then re-den with their mother as yearlings. So we could also, we follow these bears year after year and then get to see how many of those cubs survive the first year of life. And then we also get to collect data on things like their body condition, body fat, when we saw them in the den. And, I'm not sure how much, I know in terms of data, you guys think a lot about, data, big data, how much you guys think about telemetry or wildlife collars. But these collars were programmed to collect a GPS location every hour on these bears. They work really well. Usually they get about 95, 97% of the fixes work. And it works with the satellite system. So the collar gets a GPS fix that gets uploaded to a satellite program, and then that comes down to me. And so my email would look something like this, where all the different bear callers would email me every hour with a new fix, and that kind of would get compiled that way. And so over the course of the study, we did the study from 2011 to 2017. We collected over 900,000 caller locations. On this map, I have locations from the same bear and the same color. The city of Durango is buried under this pile of locations. And we'd get really good, amazing information on how these bears use the landscape and how they did that different times of year in different conditions. So, for example, here's the locations from one bear, B25 in 2011. She's about 3 miles as the crow flies from the downtown Durango core. She's over actually in the state wildlife area. This is Parents Peak State Wildlife Area. And she's behaving exactly like we want a bear to behave. As someone, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, this is what you want a bear to do over in the state wildlife area. Not causing any problems with people. Being a good bear. But 2012 was a different year. We had a really poor natural food year. And what this means for a bear in the Rockies generally is that a couple things can contribute to a poor natural food year. And maybe I'll back up. Bears, rely on these mass foods in the late summer and fall to put on a ton of weight. So it's really kind of nuts and berries is what you can think of, things like gamble oak, acorns, serviceberry, chokecherry. Those are kind of pinion nuts. Those are key bear foods. And one of the things that influences their abundance each year is, well, one can be drought. Summer drought can mean that mass production is low. But the other thing that really can contribute to it is having a hard late freeze. And so you can think about, if you have an apple tree that's all flowered out and you get a hard late freeze when it's all flowered, all those flowers die and then you don't have any apple production that year. And the same thing happens with these other plants. So, your acorns are going, your chokecherries or serviceberries are all flowered out. And if you have a hard late June freeze, right when those flowers are out, it can just kill off the mass production. And that's what happened to us in 2012. And so this bear started in the same place, the state wildlife area. But then by mid to late July, she moved over to Junction Creek. And then she went to town and spent the rest of the summer in downtown Durango. And what's amazing to me about this is that she didn't accidentally end up in town. This is where she went, her hourly locations, hour 1, hour 2, hour 3, she's right in town. When she decided she was ready to go, she knew exactly where town was, like there was no question. She knew, exactly where she was going. And when she made the decision, she went there immediately. So she hung out there for the rest of the summer, foraging in town, and then, went back to the state wildlife area to hibernate. 2013 was a okay food year for bears. Not great, but it was enough to keep her back on the state wildlife area. So we've been able to look at lots of these patterns of how these bears behave under these different conditions to really learn how they're responding to human development. Now, one thing I've kind of made the implicit assumption here that their bears are coming to town to forage on human foods. And just to clarify that's a valid assumption. We collected hair every time we put our hands on a bear. We collected a hair sample and looked at the stable isotopes from that. And we looked at the carbon-13 enrichment. And carbon-13, it's higher, it's enriched when you have a lot of corn or cane sugar, which you have in human processed foods. You can think of all that, all the kind of the corn sugar that's in human foods. And so sure enough, bears that spend more time in human development, they have this enriched isotope, signifying that they're consuming a lot more human foods. So that assumption holds. Okay, so what we found from all those locations was that bears really increased their use of high density of human development. Here's on my x-axis. This is the probability of selection. They increased selection for high densities of human development during these poor natural food years, and they increased it across the summer as they got towards the fall, as bears go towards that hyperphagia stage where late summer, where they're like really packing on the calories to prepare for winter, they would further increase that use of human development. But that really declined when you had a good natural food year. And so what that meant was that bears selected habitat, really differently under different conditions. A year like when you had good natural foods, good foods on the forest, good mass conditions, bears selected like this, where in this map, the hotspot map, where bears are more likely to be in places that are warmer colors and then the red. And so there's kind of a black hole around Durango. Generally, bears stayed away from town. They didn't really want to be in town when they had good foods available to them. But when they didn't have good foods available to them, it completely switched, and all of a sudden town became this magnet where, that's where bears recognized the food resources were. And they really sucked into town to take advantage of those resources and use them as a source of subsidy. But, the interesting thing is that they don't select like this in all years. No, the bears clearly knew that there's food here, but there was this right trade-off. Majority of bears recognize that it's risky to be around people. They don't want to be around people. They don't want to be around human activity. And so if they have options to forage away from that, that was preferred. But if you don't have those natural foods on the forest, then, that trade-off kind of tips, and all of a sudden it becomes worth it to you to take on that extra risk to acquire those food resources. The other thing that we found is that there was this here, what I've plotted is the mean population response. And that was found using resource selection function models. But what's important to recognize as well, this is the mean response. There was a lot of individual variation. So this came from a paper published on a few different populations of bears, but the Durango bears are here in these gray triangles, and their selection for human development was really variable. And keep that in mind, because this plays out in how bears, what their outcomes are for survival and reproduction. We also found that bears tended to increase their use of development as they aged, likely because they're gaining more experience with human development, learning where it was, and those food sources were there. And that too probably means then that we should expect conflicts to increase as bears gain more exposure and, and use these extra human food resources more regularly. Okay, well, what about hibernation? How does bear use of human development, how does this influence hibernation? Well, hibernation is important for these guys, and it's important for this issue of conflicts because, when bears are hibernating, they're not causing problems. They're not interacting with people. And some of our bears hibernated for about 6 months of the year. I mean, really long time of the year that they could be spent hibernating. So as I said, we track these female bears to their dens, and we had dens everywhere from way up in the La Plata Mountains all the way down to down in kind of the PJ Pinyon Juniper Desert, down by the New Mexico border. And so we were able to take advantage of variation both within and across years to understand what factors were associated with the time that bears spent hibernating. This is a fun little video I've got to just kind of show you what it looks like from our perspective as we go into these dens. So we go in with a jab pole that has drugs in it to immobilize the bear. The mobilization process takes about 10 minutes. Some of these dens are pretty committing, but this is pretty normal that a bear will hibernate underneath the big, kind of dig out a spot underneath the big boulder. So usually the bear's pretty sleepy when we arrive, but its first thing it's doing is trying to wake up. Usually we see a bear shaking. It's trying to get its body temperature up so it can react more quickly. So at this point, we're pulling back. The researcher's making sure that, that the safety is off because that's the worst thing you can do is hit a bear with a needle and not actually inject any drugs, and then just have a really angry bear. We're always aiming for a shoulder, a good muscle. And then once the bear is jabbed like that, then we get out of the den, try to seal up the hole, and wait for the bear to fall asleep to then be able to pull it out and do all the processing. Okay, and so on those collars, as I was saying, they get these GPS fixes every hour. The other thing they collect is activity data. So every hour for 5-minute duration, these collars record how many head tips, front, back, and side to side, is happening with the bear. And we've been able to use that to identify timing of when we consider a bear to start hibernating and when it ends hibernating. And some folks have used these collars in captivity to identify kind of thresholds, these hibernation thresholds of activity. And we're able to take advantage of that to see in the fall how this activity of these bears declines and then kind of passes this threshold of to when they initiate hibernation. And same thing with coming out. So we're able to use, again, that collar data to identify these hibernation lengths. And then see which factors were associated with changes in hibernation length. So the thing that we're really interested in is how much human development a bear used, how that influenced hibernation. So this, for example, is this the summer range in a single year for one of our collared bears. And the pink is where they're overlapping with human development. The green's where their home range is just on natural habitat. So we want to see how this influences hibernation length along with natural food availability, and then some climate kind of weather conditions, things like minimum temperature, snow depth, and then different individual attributes like age and reproductive success. And we found that all these factors were influential in determining how long a bear would hibernate, with the exception of snow depth. That didn't matter, but everything else had an influence. And something like development operated a lot like natural food. The more time bears spent using human development, the shorter time they hibernated. Hibernation, we know, is an adaptation to food shortage. But if you don't have a food shortage, if you still have access to food, you don't need to hibernate so much. So, we found that relationship. Another one I want to point out here is that temperature made a really big difference. As winter minimum temperatures, when they were higher, that really reduced the amount of time bears stayed in dens. So here's those relationships modeled out. You can see the kind of the relative influence. But we found that for every 1 degree Celsius increase in winter minimum temperatures, hibernation was reduced by 6 days, so by almost a week. And for every 10% increase in a bear's overlap with development, hibernation decreased by about 3 days. And these effects were additive. So, kind of again, as these landscapes are changing, as bears have greater access to human food, we should anticipate that this is going to have an effect where bear hibernation is going to reduce. We should also expect that with changing climate conditions, that we know that temperature is really important and that warmer weather is also going to reduce hibernation length. And this is going to likely mean that bears are interacting with people for more of the year in the future. Okay, well, what about these effects on bear demography, on things like their survival and reproduction, and how that might contribute to conflicts? There was a lot of concern with folks that that all this extra human food on the landscape, it must be bolstering bear populations. That often when people see bears in town, they see a pile of cubs, a lot of babies, suggesting that all this human food is, really kind of bolstering bear populations, potentially causing these populations to really grow. And that's why we see all these conflicts. So there's that piece, but there's also the piece that there's a lot of mortality of bears around town, around human development. And so it's been unclear about whether these, urban areas or, different kind of exurban urban development, whether this acts as a population source, kind of bolstering bear populations, or as a sink where bear populations could be negatively impacted. So we wanted to better understand this. And so we looked at how a bear's use of development, how much time they spent within development, how that influenced different survival and reproductive rates. So here, I'll just show you, we had really good data to use in La Plata County. Every structure was noted in the county data. And so we're able to put a buffer around every structure and then calculate how much time a bear spent within these kind of developed areas. And something I think is so interesting that I'll just point out from this too is it's so apparent when you look at these location data of how much human development really structures these animals' home ranges. So this was a major county road corridor in town, as well as this down here. You know, you just when you look at these maps, it just becomes so clear how these how human activity in some of these roads and things really structure animals' home ranges. Okay, but we looked to see how much time bears spent within human development, how that influenced how much body fat they had. We could estimate body fat when we visited them at their dens each winter. We wanted to see how it influenced cub productivity, like the numbers of cubs they had, how it influenced cub survival. So again, we're tracking these females year after year, so we get to see, you know, how many cubs are born this year and how many survived to be yearlings in the den the next year. And then we could track adult survival with those collars. We get a mortality signal when the collar stops moving, and we can go out and see whether an animal is dead or not. And what we found was that bear use of development had really mixed results on these fitness traits. Bears that spent more time in development had much more body fat. Human food source was definitely, you know, it was a big resource for them in terms of packing on the pounds. We also found that as their use of development increased, so did their productivity. So bears with experiencing no development are more likely to have twins, but as their use of development increased, that probability declined as their probability of having triplets increased. But we also found that the survival of those cubs declined as bear use of development increased, and that adult survival declined. So we have this, you know, positive influence on things like body condition and productivity, but a real negative effect on cub and adult survival. And so we looked at how these effects collectively, oops, sorry, I forgot my animations here. So we wanted to understand what were the collective effects on population growth. You know, because what we really want to know is how is the population changing as a whole. So to look at that, we used a population projection matrix model where we can you know, look at how these individual survival and reproductive probabilities play out in terms of projecting population change. And what we found was that as bear use of development increases, the bear population was predicted to decline. That reduced cub and adult survival just swamped out any benefits of higher productivity. You know, this is a long-lived mammal that has low reproductive output, having usually 2 cubs every other year. And so, so what really matters to these guys is survival. And when, you know, if bears are dying in and around town, then that had a big effect on how populations were projected to change. And what was interesting too to us is that the bear population in Durango, you know, using no development and under average natural food conditions, was projected to be have a population growth rate of 1, which is stable, so not increasing or decreasing. So, you know, our population is kind of stable as is, but reduced natural food conditions, increased use of development was all going to have a negative influence. Okay, so that was our projections of what we expected to happen, but we have got a real test of how populations changed in addition, because we, at the same time that we're catching and trapping bears in this really invasive way, we also, for 4 years, collected data non-invasively, collecting bear genotypes. And so we were trying to estimate the bear population size. And we used these hair snares where we'd go out in the woods, we'd set up this, I don't know if you can see it, there's some barbed wire that's strung around some aspen trees here. And then in the middle of the aspen trees, there's some burlap sacks that are soaked in things like bacon scent and anise and all kinds of gross stuff, rotting fish. So we'd hang this stinky bait. Bears would come in, check out the bait, step over the wire, They leave a hair sample. We get the hair, we genotype it, get a bear's, genetic fingerprint. And with that, essentially capture them. And then we use kind of the spatial pattern of captures. And I should say we did this all around in this big area around Durango, our study area. We're able to use these models to then estimate bear abundance and bear density. And we did this in association for the first 4 years of our study. And this is what we saw that, and I should note that on the y-axis here, I've got female bear abundance. We were really focused on females. And so what you see is that we estimated 175, 200 bears, but then there's this big decline that happened in association with that natural food shortage that we saw in 2012. So we did mass surveys each year on what foods were available for bears. And so these are 4 key ones: gamble oak, that's acorns, choke cherries, crabapple, and serviceberry. And you can see that the y-axis here is our indices of massed abundance. In 2012, I mean, the bottom just falls out. That late hard freeze combined with drought, there was essentially no food seen on these mass surveys that year. And, that coincides with this big decline that we see, where we go from 175, 200-ish female bears estimated down to about 85 bears. This 2012 year, this is this year where bears are really sucked into town. They're really using those human food resources for subsidy. But that comes at a really high cost in terms of survival. So here I'm showing you the number of black bear mortalities that we detected in the study area. And here's that 2012, that food failure year. And we just have this kind of skyrocket of mortalities happening that year. So, bears suck into town, get those food resources, but town's a dangerous place. And bears suffer real high mortality rates as a consequence of that. So with our models, we could also estimate how density changed on the landscape. So this map here, this is just showing the footprint of development around Durango. Here's the downtown core. This is going up the Animas Valley here. And then, out either way, this goes out to Bayfield, Bayfield here. And so you can see kind of the footprint of development around Durango. And this is how we estimated bear density changed before the food failure and after the food failure. So in these plots, white is basically 0 bear density, and then the green lighter colors are higher bear densities. And so, before we had the food failure, this is how we estimated density across the landscape. But after, we have this just kind of like emptying out of bears, especially along these this kind of human corridor, where all the human development is. The hatch marks here are bear mortalities that year that were detected. So, we have a lot of mortality and this is kind of like that in that previous year, a lot of mortality, especially focused around people. Mortality's up in these kind of areas is hard. This is usually harvest, like bears killed up on the forest. But all of these mortalities are, bears hit by cars, shot by landowners, removed from conflict reasons, run by a management agency, those kind of things. Okay, well, one of the big hypotheses was that all these conflicts were caused by more bears. And so, and if we maybe reduce the bear population, then we should see conflicts decline. So, this kind of natural experiment, did it work? Well, again, here's that trend in abundance I just showed you a minute ago. Here's a trend in conflicts. This is the number of conflict calls that came into Colorado Parks and Wildlife during those same 4 years. So we had just over 200 calls when the bear population was estimated, 175-ish. Skyrocketed in 2012. Again, that natural food failure year just skyrockets the number of conflicts and calls. But then our bear population gets cut in about half. And we have similar calls to what we had, when the population was double the size. We don't see that conflicts and abundance are correlated. Okay, so what about testing some solutions to reducing conflicts? I want to finish up by talking about this a little bit. And the solution that we really looked at was how effective it would be to reduce human food. You know, if you reduce human food, you potentially reduce the reason that bears come into town. And then, you know, hopefully reduce conflicts as a result. So to do this, we implemented this giant bear proofing experiment. So this is myself and one of my technicians prepping 1,000 trash containers to get deployed by the city of Durango. We put out over 1,100 bear resistant trash cans in 2 different treatment areas, these red areas here. And then we also monitored 2 paired control areas. We collected a couple years of pre-treatment data and then 4 years post-treatment data. And we want to see how this worked in terms of reducing conflicts. And so we collected a few different data types. We looked at numbers of trash conflicts. So a technician drove around at 5 o'clock in the morning to record where bears were getting into trash. We looked at people's compliance. Like if we gave you a bear can, we wanted to see if you actually locked it. Now, this was something that I thought was silly at first. I thought, well, certainly if I give someone a free $250 trash can, certainly they're going to lock it. But I was working with a human dimension specialist, Stacy Lishka, and she said, oh no, we have to measure if people actually use them. And again, I thought cost would be the true barrier. You know, I was like a poor grad student for so many years. I thought, well, cost was the barrier. So if I give someone a free can, they're definitely going to use it. But Stacy said, no, we had to estimate compliance, and she was absolutely right. And then Stacy also sent out public mail surveys to look at people's perceptions before and after we did the experiment. And so this was what the hotspots of conflicts looked like before we distributed any cans. So in the South, we had conflicts pretty well distributed throughout the treatment, what would become the treatment and control. And the North unit, most of our conflicts were in the control part. Here's what it looked like after, and the 4 years after we distributed the trash cans. We actually saw a reduction both in the treatment and the control up here. But in the South unit, we saw this pretty strong effect that those conflicts really got pushed from that treatment area where people got the cans, you know, get pushed from up here right down into the control where people didn't have those bear cans. And across the areas, we found that trash conflicts were 60% lower in treatment areas than control areas, and compliance with the ordinance, which meant you had to lock up your trash, that was about 40% higher in the treatment areas. And we saw this interesting thing where that's compliance was a key issue. So you can give people cans, but you can't make them use them. But if you can encourage most people to use them, that seems to kind of be the ticket. So what we found was that if at least about 60% of the people on your block, on your city block, were locking up their trash, whether we gave them a trash can and they used it properly or they stored it in their garage or whatever, if about 60% of people were locking up their trash, your probability of having a bear conflict at your house really declined that summer. And across our study area, this was significant, so that if across our study area, if only 10% of the people were complying with the ordinance, we predict about 270 conflicts across the summer, whereas if 80% were compliant, it would be down to like 45 conflicts. So this was a big deal. And this was this idea of this trade-off where if most people lock up their trash, it's just not worth it for a bear to take on that extra risk and to come in and forage in your neighborhood. But if a lot of your neighbors have their trash out, if you keep your trash out and a bear's got a high probability of finding food in your neighborhood, you know, your probability of having a conflict is significantly higher. What the mail surveys revealed was that doing this experiment, giving out these trash cans, had real social benefits. So people who received trash cans, they had much higher perceptions about satisfaction in management agencies. So they felt like people, had more positive perceptions of the city, more positive perceptions of Colorado Parks and Wildlife. We found that after we did this everyone supported ordinances more, but people that received those trash cans especially supported ordinances to reduce conflicts. And we found that people that didn't get the cans, people in the control areas, that they felt like they had a much higher risk of future conflicts than those people that got the cans. So we not only got a benefit from reduced conflicts, but we also see that there are these social benefits as well. Okay, so back to kind of the original questions we set out to ask, are bears changing their behavior? Well, we found, from collecting this data that yes, absolutely. We found that bears are increasing their use of development as they learn to use human foods, especially during those poor natural food years. And that the duration of bear hibernation is decreasing with greater use of human foods and with warmer temperatures. And given expanding development, development continues to go like gangbusters in Colorado, reduced hibernation and changing climate conditions, which we expect to cause more frequent natural food failures in the future, we should expect more bear conflicts in the future. Okay, what about the question, are there more bears? Well, in our study area, no. We found that bear use of development did have mixed effects on different vital rates, but it had a net negative effect in population growth. That female bear abundance sharply declined when bear use of development increased due to all that extra mortality. And it's often assumed that increases in conflicts must be driven by an increase in the bear population. And that's usually what happens. State management agencies see increases in conflicts and they up harvest rates. That's usually the knob that gets turned first. But if human development is sucking bears into these areas, because bears see this extra human food, then it's an ecological trap, and we should expect that conflicts could increase even if you have a stable or even a declining bear population, that we can see conflicts increase. And this underscores the importance of really being able to understand and track changes in bear populations, especially as landscape conditions change. Okay, so what should managers do about it? Well, definitely invest in strategies that remove these attractants that motivate this unwanted behavior. And we recognize that effective management will require new strategies with working with municipalities, and ultimately are going to rely on changing human behavior. We're not going to change bear behavior. It's evolved over tens of thousands of years, but we really need to focus on, to be effective on changing human behavior. And this is, I think, a key thing to think about, because an agency like Colorado Parks and Wildlife is responsible for managing bear conflicts, but they're not responsible for managing waste. That falls on the cities and the municipalities. So, this can be a tricky thing. And it's also important to recognize that the data we collected don't support some really long-held assumptions. Things like, more conflicts must mean more bears. There's a common assumption that, once a problem bear, always a problem bear. See a bear in town, we should kill it because it's always going to be a problem. We didn't see that. We saw bears were much more dynamic than that. Okay, so we finished the study in 2017. How's the results been used in management? Well, after we did the study, the city of Durango invested money to purchase, now it's probably closer to 2,000, but they purchased lots more self-locking bear-resistant trash containers. They outfitted those control areas all with bear cans. That got the city up to like 70% bear-proof, and they've been working on bear-proofing the remainder. Outside of Durango, so in Durango, it's really changed. It's become a city that's largely bear-proof. Conflicts have dramatically declined. Outside Durango, the research has been used as justification for cities across Colorado to adopt stronger ordinances and require bear cans. And this has happened. It's been pretty exciting to see. Places like Colorado Springs, Steamboat Springs, Bayfield, places across Colorado are using the Durango study as justification for making. It's also changed Colorado Parks and Wildlife's narrative on bear-human conflicts. It's altered management of bears within developed areas and parts of the state, and helped stimulate a statewide conflict database to really understand, especially how conflicts are responding to different management strategies. And, the research has been reaching general audiences, as Nathan said, Dusty Hewlett did a documentary on the project, and he did just a great job, and it's gotten a lot of attention. Now, it's available on PBS. But this has been way more effective than, our dozen published papers on this issue. Dusty's film, in terms of really motivating change, has been really remarkable. I mean, people call me from different city councils and things about the papers, and I always supply them, but then I say, watch Dusty's film and show your film to your city managers and the rest of your city council. And this is often what is really inspiring change. And so that's what I had for today, and I'd love to take any questions if I have time.
Any questions in the chat?
Nothing there so far.
Not yet. We'll let them populate. Elsa's got a question.
I have a question. It's possible it's mostly an excuse for me to tell my bear story, but I do actually have a related question. So we had a bear break into a cabin in Red Lodge, and we came back and found her on the bed eating tortillas. After having thrown the refrigerator across the room to get to them. And the rangers ended up shooting this bear, and they were pretty sure that she was dead because they set off a flare and no response. And so I guess I'm just curious about, you're talking about like the benefit versus the risk for the bear, like they're making this decision. Are there any measures that are targeting like increasing the bear's perception of risk for going into different places? Because that particular bear had no sense of risk, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's a great question. So how do you alter the risk landscape? I mean, some things that they do under normal conditions would be things like really target at certain individuals. They shoot bean bags, at bears. They shoot cracker shells. They, kind of different strategies to try to, they unleash dogs. They've got bear dogs that they'll unleash on bears to chase them. So, there's various kind of hazing. Some folks in Colorado Parks and Wildlife, I think, have started using tasers on bears. I mean, so there's different strategies to try to give bears bad experiences to kind of up the risk. That maybe works on very targeted individuals, but you can't do that for a whole bear population. What are you gonna do that with the 400 bears that we marked around Durango? It's not going to work. And even when you target individuals, the data is pretty soft on whether it's very effective. And you think, so maybe in this instance, a bear gets chased off of a resource, but guaranteed they can find another resource a couple miles down the road, right, or somewhere else. So that's where, some of these strategies to like haze individual bears, personally, I think it's not the best use of resources, but it is done for sure.
Go ahead.
Could you talk a little bit more about how you're measuring good versus bad natural food years, what that data is and where it's coming from? It just seems like that was a pretty strong predictor of some of these relationships in the models that you showed.
Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned that before. So we had all the technicians, we walked transects every other week through the summer. We had 1 kilometer transects distributed throughout our study area. And it was a qualitative measure where folks would walk their transects and score the availability of mass that they saw across the kilometer walk. What did they see in terms of serviceberry or chokecherry, how much mass that they generally saw, and then where it was in terms of phenology. So in terms of fruiting, was it just starting to fruit? Was it full fruiting? So we collected that data across all years of the study as well to index what was happening with food conditions.
Thanks.
You showed that graph of mortality, and I noticed that there was still quite a bit of harvesting. So why was there still so much harvesting in that year? And if they saw the bear population declining, why are harvesting rates still as high as they are?
Mm. Yeah. So one thing is most places in Colorado, we know very little about the bear population, what it's doing, very little. So we have really good information on like how many elk are there, how many mule deer in different herds. Ungulates are like, we can nail the estimates. Like wildlife management agencies are really good at nailing ungulate population estimates. Carnivores are hard. You think ungulates come like in the winter, they get surveyed when they're on winter ranges, they're hemmed in by snow, they aggregate. The winter there's no foliage on, deciduous plants, all that stuff. But it's something like a bear or a mountain lion. They're in low densities, they're solitary. Bears are underground during the easiest time of year to see them. So all those reasons mean that they're incredibly difficult to estimate abundance, and like to do our abundance estimate, it's a huge effort and crazy amounts of money to like genotype all those bears. And our study area is like a postage stamp relative to the state of Colorado. So Colorado Parks and Wildlife has done these estimates in different parts of the state in some cases, but often it's a one-off estimate. So we basically know very little often about the bear population, and yet it's being managed at the same time. So harvest rates are being set. And guess what? If you don't know how many bears there really are, but you know how many conflicts there are, what are you going to manage for? Bears often get managed based on conflict rates. So that's often what's most responsive. So yeah. And harvest isn't that dynamic. It often gets changed. It doesn't get changed. At the most, it maybe can get changed annually, but usually it's not, every few years or something. So harvest isn't necessarily, changes in harvest aren't that responsive. Usually the changes are being made in the absence of any data on actual bear population trend. The only data usually managers have is harvest data. They use like proportion of females that were harvested the year before to try to get a sense maybe of whether the population is stable or increasing or decreasing. And the other thing I'd say is that an objective of Colorado Parks and Wildlife in recent years has been to reduce the bear population. So that's been a goal. In a lot of places they've upped harvest rates. You can, in some places, I think, take 2 bears instead of 1. You get your concurrent bear license with your elk license. I mean, there's been a lot of things to actively work to reduce the bear population, largely because of conflicts.
Just to follow up to that, there was that big spill, that big like environmental disaster spill in Durango, somewhere that was right towards the end of your study.
Yeah.
Did you notice any rise or any cause of mortality from that big spill?
No, I mean, the river ran orange, right? It was like a crazy time, but no, yeah, we didn't see anything there with the bears.
Thanks.
I think there's one question in the chat. Can you?
Yeah, so the question is, what about our packaged food storage, including beer cans, bags, tree hangs? Do you know how they measure up to the effectiveness of trash cans in Durango?
Well, tree hangs are not very good. So if you're gonna go backpacking, definitely get or rent a bear proof or a bear can for your backpack. So those things are bomber. That's definitely, they work, yeah, those things work. Bear hangs, I mean, some places bears have learned to climb the tree and launch themselves onto the hang and pull the bag down. So so definitely my recommendation is to avoid the hang and just suck it up, and from REI or rent yourself a bear can for a weekend backpacking trip.
Avoid the hang.
All right. Thank you, Heather, again for agreeing to come talk to us. We appreciate your time this morning. And if you're back in Colorado anytime, please come see us.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me, you guys. Yeah, take care.